It's really a privilege to be speaking to this group today. Um, so many wonderful researchers affiliated with this. So, as previously mentioned, I'm going to be talking about socioecological and approaches to language. And just as Antonella said, I'm originally from New York City, but I've been in Quebec now for 21 years. And this is just a little map of Canada. Canada is a big place. It's over north, just north of another big place. What's interesting about Canada is that it's federally bilingual, but it provincially differs. And Quebec is the only province in all of Canada that is provincially monolingual. So what we have is a very interesting situation where you have generally a sea of English speaking people with a little isolated part of a lot of French speakers. And in fact, my understanding is that Quebec is Montreal and Quebec contains the second most highest population of French speakers globally. So I'm going to zoom in on Quebec. This is a map of language variation within Quebec, and I want to thank Esteban Hernandez Rivera. He's the map man in my lab right now. And so what's being plotted here is linguistic variation, and I'm going to zoom in on this. Oops, let me zoom in on this. Okay, I'm going to zoom in on this. So dark colors mean lower linguistic variation, light colors mean high linguistic variation. So within Quebec, what's interesting is we have another little special situation where right in here, you can't really totally see it, that's Montreal. That's where McGill is, that's where we do our work, and you can see that it's very different. So in the same way that Quebec is different from the rest of Canada, Montreal is very different from the rest of Quebec in terms of having high linguistic variation. And as Antonella mentioned, this means that language is front and center news all the time because of different language policy efforts to keep French alive, to regulate English. And in fact, I just grabbed some headlines from literally 3 days ago. There's a recent controversy that everybody's talking about where there is a new provincial policy to raise tuition in Quebec universities for out of province people to try to keep English speaking people, a lower population, so on and so forth. So this is every day. It's like in Alaska, everybody talks about fishing. In Quebec, in Montreal, everybody's talking about language. Okay, so just to zoom in a little bit more on how language is used in Montreal, this is 2016 census statistics. And here's the island of Montreal. Blue is French, red is English, and other colors are other languages. And you can see it's predominantly French in Montreal, except in the west part of the island, there's more English, and then in other parts, there are other languages being spoken. And so, but it's a mix. It's kind of a real mix. And you could contrast that with other cities in Canada. So Ottawa is not very far away. And this is a river running through a sea of English on one side of the river and French on the other. It's very neat and orderly. In Toronto, not much French, but a lot of other languages, a lot of English, and you can see it's all mixed in. And then if you go all the way west to Vancouver, again, multilingualism and bilingualism is high there, but it's a different kind of multilingualism that you see in other parts of Canada. And you can see how the distributions across these different places really vary. Now, we could play this game in the United States, and I want to thank Ethan Kutlu for sending me these slides to use. So you all are there in South Carolina. So South Carolina tends to have is mostly English. So in terms of being plotting language other than English spoken at home, this is a different kind of linguistic diversity, right? And if you zoom in on South Carolina, I looked at some statistics just to see. So from the Migration Policy Institute, which is looking at U.S. Census data, the percentage of people who speak only English across different age groups is very, very high, and the people who speak languages other than English is quite low. But what was interesting to me is when you zoom in on English proficiency for people who speak other languages, you break it into people who speak English very well versus those who don't. It's different across different linguistic communities, right? Again, attesting to the idea that different linguistic communities, multilingual communities within a location might have different local environmental supports that support either the language of the community or the heritage language. So like, for example, Spanish is more balanced. Lots of people speaking English very well, everybody's speaking English very well, but you could see the asymmetry in terms, and what's interesting here is that different sub-communities might have other supports that keep their heritage language alive versus others. So all of these things are playing a role. So multilingualism is really an ecological personal journey, okay? So what I don't need to convince you all of this, but I'm gonna just, we could just talk about this here. So here what I have pictured are all the wonderful people in my lab, and like quite literally, I could go to every single box and person within this image, and everybody has a completely different linguistic and multilingual story, right? And as we all know, within the study of cognition and psycholinguistics, what we've been interested in is to try to tell general stories about multilingualism and bilingualism, but also to value individual differences. And as you can see on this side, these are just the numerous ways people can differ that can impact the language and cognition as it's measured in real time, as it's used naturally in the environment. So we have things like how many languages do people speak, the timing of when they learn those languages, the simultaneous sequential heritage speaker or not, code switching, immigrant status, the social distribution of the languages, so on and so forth. So this is a very complex space. And the whole point of this keynote paper that I co-authored with Margot Tiv, who is now a postdoc at the US Census Bureau, was to try to come to terms with this complexity, right? So I'm somebody in my career, I've always been interested in individual differences. Obviously, trying to identify general principles within science is important, but you want to get a sweet spot where your general principles don't sweep under the rug other idiosyncratic things that may matter. So, but the challenge here, of course, is that there are so many individual differences to grapple with, and how can we organize this space? So we wrote this keynote in the spirit of trying to deal with that, and we were really lucky to have commentaries from people in the field, and it was a really fun exchange, and it was fun to write the response to it, and I really encourage you all to take a look if you're interested. And this is a hybrid meeting, so we can't chit chat after the session, but I want to encourage you to feel free to send me an email if you want to continue the conversation beyond this. So what is this systems framework of bilingualism that we're talking about? So the idea here, it's predicated on the assumptions that social context is important and social experiences are multifaceted. And missing from the study of human behavior and cognition, such as language and bilingualism, is this sort of idea. Like when I came up as a graduate student studying psycholinguistics and cognitive psychology, there was really an emphasis on identifying general principles, and really individual differences was always kind of a side gig. It wasn't the main event. But I think now people are starting to really recognize the fact that we can't ignore individual differences. But of course, as I just said, the challenges are organization, operationalization, and quantification of these experiences to predict something about behavior, right? Because we want to encourage complexity, but we also want to have rigorous experiments or rigorous approaches to try to figure out and piece together what are the independent contributions of different factors. So that's what this systems framework was really intended to do. And really, this was something that we wanted to do in our lab to try to organize the space. And of course, it borrows heavily from socio-ecological models in development. There have been other instances like this, but we really wanted to tailor it to our particular situation. So if you look at this model, so I'm using the term ego. I'm not really a Freud fan, although I did like Jung, and that's what got me into psychology. But we use the term ego because within the social network literature, that's how they refer to the individual within a social network. And really, the psychology, the study of of psycholinguistics is really about mapping what do individuals do, right? But individuals are nested in this complex space. So individuals are nested in an interpersonal space, which deals with person-to-person interactions, an ecological space, which pertains to perhaps neighborhood, school, workplace characteristics. And then there's societal factors that are at play, right? What are the societal values, the beliefs, the language policies that are operative on people? And then, of course, all these things can change over time, right? So they can change over historical time, they could change over developmental time. So this is a very complex space, but the thing that I really like about this is that encourages us to think concretely about how can we organize the different variables and the factors that are operative on people when we design and think about our experiments, because there could be cross-level interactions, within-level interactions, and of course the behaviors that we focus on could really vary. They could be cognitive behaviors, they could be attitudes, neuroplasticity, identity, so on and so forth, okay? So what I'm going to do now is give you an example of how we've applied this systems framework and how it's been useful to us for thinking through experimental questions. So in this one paper led by Tiv, we tried to do this. And so one of the things we relied on in this paper was looking at social network data, right? So social networks, this approach is used quite a bit in social psychology and sociology, less so within psycholinguistics, although our lab has been using it. People like Eleonora Rossi, other people in second language acquisition have been doing it. And the idea here is that you could create a network representation where the nodes or the circles are who are the people in your life. The edges, they refer to them as the edges or the lines. Do these people talk to each other? So you can basically tap into people's social space. And from this, there's a really long, a rich literature where you can extract really interesting quantifications from these kind of data. So you can extract things like network size, network density, number of components, so on and so forth, right? So what we wanted to do was use this approach, but not only just ask who are the people in your life and do they talk to each other, but we also wanted to know what languages do they talk to each other in. And so from this, we can create networks so each little box here represents an individual and the different kinds of social networks that we were able to extract from the data that they presented. And you could see each color represents a different language or a different configuration of language, right? So red might be that the person, so this person, the ego talks to them only in English. Another color would be they talk to them in English plus another language, or English and French, so on and so forth, right? So what this allows us, and you can see all of these networks are very different for different people. So it's not always the same thing for different people. And these, if you're interested in examining how the interpersonal factors impact individual behavior, these differences could matter. So what we were able to do from data like this is extract a series of well-worn network science measures, and we could extract them for the full network for everybody, irrespective of the languages that you use with people. We could extract it for the English subnetwork, so just really looking at extracting a network based on only the people you speak English with. The same thing for only the people you speak French with, and then a bilingual subnetwork, right? So now we can get a quantification of how people interact generally and then interact in language-specific ways. And what this allows us to do is then use statistical approaches to try to reduce this space, to try to come up with factors that we can then use in our models to predict something about behavior. So this is what we did in this paper. So we had all these data, and then what we did was we ran a principal component analysis on these data to try to identify factors that cut through this multidimensional space. And when we did it for the people in this experiment, we found that there were 4 factors that came to the fore. Factor 1 was the degree to which people use French in their lives. And you can't see this, but if you look at the paper, you'll see that all of this has to do with French related measures from the social network questionnaire. A separate factor is the degree to which people use English. Another factor is the degree to which people are bilingual or using multiple languages with individual people. And then the other thing I didn't mention is that in this principal component analysis, we didn't just include these social network factors, we also included data about the language census properties of the neighborhoods in which these people lived. And so we're going to call this ecological factors. And what was interesting is that when we entered this into this factor analysis, the ecological factor loaded on its own dimension. And what's interesting about how it loaded in the context of Montreal is that higher values of this factor indicates higher cross-language diversity, census-based cross-language diversity within the person's neighborhood, higher English use and less French use. And this is really interesting because if you live in Montreal, you know that there tends to be the Francophone neighborhoods tend to be very, very Francophone, whereas the more Anglophone neighborhoods really tend to be highly bilingual. So this factor is picking that out. And so what's really cool about this is that now we have quantifications. Oh my God, my phone is ringing. Okay, now we have quantifications that allow us to track the interpersonal level of this framework and the ecological level. And then we could look to see how do those factors impact something about performance on the ego. So, and we can ask the question, which factors predict language behavior? And maybe we could begin to try to study this somewhat independently, like we can isolate different factors. So that's what we tried to do. So now what we're doing in this plot is basically I'm predicting from a separate questionnaire the percentage of conversations in English that people use, the percentage of conversations in French that people use. And as the predictor, I'm looking at the French factor, the English factor, the bilingual factor, and that ecological factor, the neighborhood census factor that I told you about. So just as a sanity check, as the French factor goes up, conversations in English go down, and the reverse for conversations in French. So that's good, right? Because if that didn't happen, we would be in trouble. And that the opposite is happening for the English factor. Now, I find this to be very interesting, you know, with respect to language policy, especially for conversations in French, which is very important to Quebec. So what this is saying to me a little bit is that the more French people you have in your life, obviously the more French you're going to use, and the less, and the more English people you have in your life, the less French you're going to use, right? So, but what's interesting to me is that some of the language policies that are being put out there are really segregating people. So if the goal is to promote French, maybe you don't want to segregate people to the extent that the policies might be doing. This is just speculation. Going down to the bilingual factor, what you can see here is as the bilingual factor goes up, conversations in English go down, but not much changes for conversations in French. And then the ecological factor is sort of interesting because remember, we're testing this all in one statistical model. So these effects are statistically controlling for the others. As that ecological factor goes up, conversations in English go up because remember, it's the bilingual neighborhoods where Anglophones typically live, and the conversations in French go down. Now we could play this game. So this is interesting because it's telling us the different kinds of factors and their impact on the ego for this particular behavior. We can also play this game with other kinds of dependent variables. So for the same people, we have vocabulary scores from Lexicale English and Lexicale French. So now we could ask the question, how far down do these socioecological factors impact individual people? Is it just at the level of the languages they use? Does it impact vocabulary? Does it impact real-time processing? These are kinds of questions that we could go on to ask. And what was interesting here is that for vocabulary, the French factor did similar things as what I told you before. The English factor was unaffected. So English vocabulary was unaffected by the degree to which people interact with people in English, but the French factor was affected, right? So as the English factor went up, French vocabulary tended to go down. nothing for bilingual factor, nothing for ecological factor, right? So the point here is not just the content of the data and the story that I'm telling you here, but also the approach, right? The approach that what we're trying to do is extract particular kinds of fixed effects or variables, independent variables that map onto this framework and try to look at how they independently impact people. We also did this with attitudes and identity. So we basically, for the same people, administered an attitudes questionnaire, and the individual items are here in the attitudes questionnaire. Across all the items, again, we ran a principal component analysis to try to reduce the space. And what we found in this principal component analysis were 5 factors that cut through this space. And one of the factors seemed to us to be French greater than English solidarity. So the kinds of items that were endorsed here is French makes me feel secure, I feel true to myself when I speak French, so on and so forth. Another factor was English general. We called English is a beautiful language. I like how English sounds. I feel motivated to speak English. Another factor was minority language protection. So this would be items like, I believe there should be more legislation protecting the Indigenous languages of Canada, so on and so forth. The 4th factor is something we thought of as French plus English prestige. So French is, what do we do here? French is more elegant than language. Speaking French increases the value and prestige of what I say, but also speaking in English increases the value and prestige of what I say. And English is a language that is important to know in order to get far in life. And then finally, the factor had to do with French language protection. I think French is a good, valuable variety of French. I think more legislation should be put in place to protect the vitality of French. So now this is complicated. I'm going to reduce it down. So basically what we did was we wanted to predict those different components from the attitudes questionnaire from the same interpersonal and ecological factors that I told you about before. And when we did this, the only effects that were significant here was that the more French interpersonal activity that people had in their life, that linked to attitudes about French greater than English solidarity. And then that ecology factor that I told you about, the one that where people who live in more bilingual neighborhoods, that linked to increased ideas about minority language protection and language prestige generally, French plus English language prestige. Okay, so again, this is important not just to tell you the outcome of this research, because, and mind you, what if you were to do this in your location, the way this plays out may be different because of the sociolinguistic and socioecological particularities of Montreal. And I think that that's a feature and not a bug, right? So, because I think we need to think through how different locations around the world support multilingualism or not, and how the factors, how these different interpersonal, ecological, societal factors might differentially push things around for individual people. Now, mind you, we have other there's other work by our group looking at social network studies and things like this. So I just want to call your attention to it, but I don't really have the time to tell you about it today, unfortunately. Now, in the time that remains, I'm going to switch to a slightly different topic, but a related topic, which is, again, this idea of how to easily and conveniently assess socioecologically relevant dimensions about people in a way that makes it easy to quantify and use in our statistical models to try to keep the complexity down to the extent possible. And one of the measures that we've really been looking at a lot in our lab, and this is led by the amazing Jason Gullifer, is this concept of language entropy. Now, as we all know, bilinguals, if you look at the bilingualism literature, there tend to be like the usual suspects of individual differences of what people look at. So percentage second language exposure, second language age of acquisition, and these are really important measures, but they don't get at this idea of distribution of language, of how you use language across the day or generally. So Jason and I decided to apply this concept of entropy, which is just an aggregation tool, to questionnaire-based language history data. And you could do this in multiple ways, right? You could do this where you can get a language entropy measure generally, just taking it right from the L2 exposure measure, or you could do it across social contexts. And it's really important to keep that in mind when you read papers that look at language entropy, that not all language entropy measures are going to be the same thing, right? So the devil's really in the details. But what pervades all of them is this idea that entropy is kind of a measure of predictability or chaos in a way, right? So if you're somebody who uses your multiple languages in very predictable ways, in this context, I only use this language. In this context, I only use that language. You're going to be very low entropy on how you use those languages because it's very predictable. Whereas if you're somebody where it's both all languages all the time, you're going to be very high entropy. And what's cool about entropy is, again, you can get a single number that can quantify this really potentially interesting sociolinguistic dimension that along which people vary. So this is what we've been doing in our lab. So if you're interested, here's some recent papers that we have using entropy to predict something about cognitive control. And in fact, I love this paper out of Ellen Bialystock's lab where they look at the impact of language entropy on cognitive control in Toronto and apply it in a very nuanced way, in a very socio-ecological way. So I want to call your attention to that paper as well. But the question that I have, having thought about language entropy a lot and having thought about socio-ecological models a lot, is, are they reflecting the same thing? Right? And I hope that they are, but we really need to validate language entropy. And one of the reasons why we might want to do that is because on questionnaire data, it's very easy to extract language entropy measures, whereas to do a social network study, it takes a little bit more get up and go to collect the data, to analyze the data, so on and so forth. So do we need to go that far to tap into the interpersonal level, or will language entropy suffice? So we're now running, this is brand new data. So this is a small project led by Antonio Iniesta, Michelle Yang, and Anne Beatty Martinez in my lab, though Anne Beatty Martinez just left for a new position at UCSD. But what we're doing is, I had data where we had, for 96 French-English bilinguals, where we had social network data, and we also had questionnaire-based language entropy data from the same people. So what we wanted to do is look to see if we do some kind of statistical analysis of these data. Does the questionnaire-based language entropy data load with the social network-based data? So are they tapping into the same thing? So this is really new. So I'm sorry that the data aren't, it's not presented in a pretty fashion. But basically, we did an exploratory factor analysis. And in fact, the questionnaire-based language entropy, which is here indicated by LHQ, is loading with the social network-based language entropy. And it also seems to track, in terms of the social network data, with the percentage of L2 speakers that you have in your interpersonal environment. And then loading separately is the percentage of L1 speakers that you have in your environment. And when we take factor scores from this exploratory factor analysis and assign factor scores for these two components to individual people, and then we separate it by sociolinguistically defined groups. So about a third of the people were English-French bilinguals, so English L1, French L2. Another approximately a third were French L1, English L2, and then another third was simultaneous. This factor score differentiates the groups, which is nice because it's another way of sort of verifying that we're getting kind of what we expect. Okay, so where have we been? So again, interpersonal and ecological levels have distinct impacts on different kinds of language behaviors and attitudes. And we're continuing in my lab to try to map this space, guided by this kind of a framework, which helps us organize the data. Social networks and questionnaire-based language entropy are both measures of language diversity or balance that predicts different kinds of behaviors and neural processes potentially, but it may differ for different sociolinguistic groups. It may differ for different kinds of outcome measures. Social network and questionnaire-based language entropy measures appear to share common variants and distinguish sociolinguistically separate groups, which is a relief to me, because this is how we've been approaching this within my lab. So I'm feeling positive that we're tapping into similar underlying constructs with these different measures. And then just in conclusion, a systems framework of bilingualism may be useful for organizing the complexity of our social environments and experiences. And again, this isn't really a theory, like the way, you have theories in cognitive psychology. So it's not like we're going to prove it or disprove it. It's really just an organizational tool. It's a framework to try to understand and sort through how different variables might map to different factors. There obviously can and will be relationships between these things, but I believe the degree to which we can try to keep these factors separate and distinct conceptually and maybe statistically will allow us to sort of take what could be seen as a chaotic individual differences space and try to extract some general principles while also respecting the many ways that people differ and the many ways that language environments differ with respect to multilingualism. And we're not snobs about methods, right? So I'm more of a quantitative researcher, but qualitative approaches could fit within this space as well. So really you could use questionnaires, social network analyses, neural measures, what have you. So that's all I have. And I want to thank you for listening. And I want to thank the people in my lab and the former people in my lab and the funding agencies. So again, I'm open to questions. And if you want to continue the conversation with me by email or some other way, I'm open to that too. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Debra, for the fantastic presentation. It really is so informative because it's so crucial now to, understand the diversity of the bilingual experience in ways that can also be quantified. So I think, what you're presenting is really an amazing tool that I hope, to understand better in the future and apply it to my own work as well. Now, time for questions. Yes, yes. How? Just with this?
So just to make everyone aware how the questions work, we've got online audience there, and Kaya's our chair. And we can take the questions now from the room. Kaya, if we can take the question from the room first, and then we pass on. So we tend to do hopping online, offline. So, and you need to have a mic because otherwise people online cannot hear you.
Hello, Deb. So good to see you. It's Anna.
Oh, Anna. Hi.
It's good to see you. This is my question. So we dabbled a little bit with the idea of entropy, me and Roxana Botezatu. And as you know, we're in El Paso, and it strikes me El Paso is a lot like Montreal in a way. We're very bilingual in an area that's around us more English, right? So what I was shocked at, despite the fact that the participants regularly use English and Spanish in multiple contexts throughout their day, they were low in entropy because all of them showed this pattern. So it was really illuminating that because everyone had this similar pattern. So basically entropy can be low with bilingual use being high. Like you have a very bilingual day, but the entropy is still low.
Okay, well, I would need to look at what and how you did that.
Yeah.
Of course, with any measure, it's
Yeah.
only as good as the range that you
Right.
have, right? In
Right.
terms of predicting something. So
Right.
if one of the good things about Montreal is we have a fantastic range, right? Because there are people who run the spectrum, run the, like, from low to high. The other thing to keep in mind is I'm not sure if the absolute value of an entropy score is really what's at issue or really like the key thing, but it's really more how it separates people within a particular sample. And then the third thing that occurs to me is that, again, it really matters on how you compute it, right? So one way that we compute it in our lab is we do it like general entropy. So basically we take the percentage L2 usage value that's global, and instead of saying percentage L2 usage, we compute an entropy value on it. So if you're 50-50 L1, L2, you're going to be high entropy, but if you're asymmetric, you're going to be low, right? So that is a kind of entropy. But what also might be happening with general entropy is it's stabilizing the fact that sometimes when people tell us what their L1 is, it's unclear and it may not be entirely reliable. So it really depends. Like the devil's in the details, and I'm happy to chat with you at some point about your particular data set, if that would be helpful.
Great insight. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, yes, are there any questions online?
Currently, I do not see any questions online, so maybe we can take one more
Okay,
question in
so we can
person.
take the next question there. Yes.
Hi, Debra. I'm Adrian Garcia, and nice to meet you. So my question is more about policy, and I am a person who lives in a laboratory like a rat, and I really sometimes struggle a lot thinking about policy. And the good thing is that I took a role, a little bit more of more administrative role in my institution, and I was making me think a lot about this. This is the reason why I'm here, honestly, at this conference. I think it's perfect. So my question is very policy oriented. I hope your data is really, really open. I mean, really highlight a lot of the things that I've been thinking about. So I'm just going to ask you one question. It's not a question, actually, it's your opinion. So imagine your institution where you are doing your research is mostly monolingual, monocultural. So it's very one language, one culture. And the few bilingual people that live there or students most likely have very low entropy because they're mostly English in one particular setting and the other language in the other particular setting, right? So my question is like, how bad would it be for that particular institution for suddenly changing a rule of language requirements? In most institutions, the language requirements are 4 semesters, and now they are, for example, changing to only 2. So my role is to actually stop that, and I'm trying to think how, but I just don't know, especially when all people think that it doesn't worth it because, everyone speaks just one language. So I trying to think your perspective, and your model seems like it's a very good model to actually make a point. I just don't know how to make. Thank you. It's just an opinion. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, this is a very interesting question. I'm not a language policy researcher, but as I said, because of the city I live in, I'm thinking about language policy all the time, right? And just like at my university, even though McGill is English, I would say that the people who, like the students, aren't necessarily all monolingual. Like there's a range of entropy, if you will, even within English institutions in Montreal. But your question is very interesting, and because one of the things it brings out is how do we bring more language into a community? Is requiring second language instruction the way, or is just ensuring that the people within the community have access to other people to talk to who use multiple languages? Do we want to, instead of having explicit instruction, have some classes in one language, other classes in another language? And really all, like the way I think about policies, like all these factors really depends on what your goal is, right? So if the goal is to affirm one language to the exclusion of all others, well, maybe you're going to approach policy in a different kind of way than if your goal is to maximize multilingualism. But what's interesting is that from my perspective, just living a language policy, living in a highly salient language policy space, is that enhancing multilingualism might actually have the added benefit of enhancing and affirming one language, right? Depending on how that language is positioned within the socio-ecological space. So again, my personal opinion about what's happening in Quebec is that there have recently been policy changes to change like junior colleges, who gets into the English versus the French junior colleges, and now the universities, with the goal of affirming French. But actually, it feels that it could be counterproductive to the extent that you eliminate bilingualism from a space where there's going to be a lot of Anglophone speakers. You're just going to make them more Anglophone, right? So these are very tricky issues. And I have to say, as I go on, I'm getting more and more interested in policy, but that's a very thorny area, right? Because it dovetails with so many different other concerns, political, what have you, right? But I think it's really important for us as language researchers, and I'm a cognitive psychologist by training, but I think it's really important for us to start thinking through how the studies we do in the lab might relate and might scale up. Even if it's speculative, because those speculations might lead to experiments, and certainly they play into a socio-ecological approach, right? I personally think bilingualism matters, right? That's why I'm here. Thank you.
I think there's time for maybe one more question.